Our first guest is a freelance journalist and photographer in Chicago. His historical nonfiction book, Alchemy of Bones, Chicago's Lutgard Murder Case of 1897, was published in 2003 by the University of Illinois Press. His reporting and writing have appeared in many publications, including the Tribune, The Reader, Chicago Magazine, Crane's Chicago Business, Playbill, Belt Magazine, and Time Out Chicago. His concert photography and reviews appear on his blog, undergroundbee.com, and you can follow him at Robert Loerzel. But for now, please give him a warm welcome to Robert Loerzel.
Thank you. Now, a few of you here who know me personally know that I'm not really much of a sports guy. So you kind of be surprised that my topic is sports related. It's easy to get sidetracked when you're doing historical research. I wasn't looking for anything that had anything to do with baseball history. I just happened to find it. This was about 10 years ago. I was in the Harold Washington Library's newspaper microfilm room. I was researching some murders and other events that happened in Chicago in 1903. And as I scrolled through the pages of the Chicago American, this was a sensational newspaper that William Randolph Hearst published. Something on the sports pages just happened to catch my eye. It was a headline about a baseball game. A headline about a team called the Chicago Microbes. Now that stopped me in my tracks. What the hell was that? And I kept going through the pages, and I saw headline after headline about this team with a bizarre name. Microbes win by a score of 6-5. Comiskey says my White Sox will beat the Microbes. Microbes lose second place to Giants. Microbes are back on home diamond. Now, it didn't take me long to figure out that these were stories about Chicago's team in the National League. Yes, it's the one we know as the Cubs. Why were they called the Microbes of all things? This got me started on the quest to answer this question. I looked at some books about Cubs history, but most of them didn't even mention the fact that the Cubs were ever called the Microbes. Now, the team had a bunch of nicknames in its early years. When they played for the first time in 1876, they were called the White Stockings. By the 1890s, they were known as the Colts because so many of them were young and inexperienced. In 1898, their famous longtime manager-player Cap Anson was fired, and so the players that were left over after he got fired were called orphans. It was like they'd lost their father. A few years later, some of the players jumped over to the new American League, and the ones who stayed behind were called the remnants. Now, you might be wondering, why didn't the team's management just come up with a name and stick with it? Well, back in this era, teams did not have official nicknames. Sports writers and fans just came up with names. Some of them stuck, and some of them didn't. As far as anyone has been able to figure out, the first time anyone called them the Cubs was March 27, 1902. That's when the Chicago Daily News used the term. But they didn't officially become the Cubs overnight. It was just one of several names that sports writers were using for them. They also called them the Panamas, the Zephyrs, and the Spuds, which apparently is sort of anti-Irish slur on them. Now, I did find a couple of history books that mentioned the Microbes. And these books said they were called the Microbes because the players were so small. Well, that could be. The team did have one of the lightest weighing players in Major League history, Johnny the Crab Evers. He was part of the famous double play combo. You may still remember the phrase, Tinkers to Evers to Chance. He was 5'9" and he weighed 125 pounds. And a few of his teammates were scrawny too. But, I looked at some sports blogs where people have researched this kind of thing, and the team's median height that year was 5'9", which is the exact same as the median height for the whole major leagues. So they weren't really especially short. And the books that suggest this theory that the Microbes name came out of them being small had no evidence to back it up. There's no footnotes, no references to an old newspaper story or anything. So one thing to consider here is that people were talking a lot about microbes at the turn of the 20th century. people were still getting used to the idea that microscopic organisms could make them sick. Only a dozen years earlier, some Chicago doctors still believed the old theory that human illnesses were spread by a mysterious gas called miasma. The newspapers quoted one Chicago physician laughing at the whole idea of microbes. He said they were a figment of imagination, but the Tribune warned readers to watch out for a microbe mob that was spreading diseases. People also used the word microbe to describe a contagious cultural phenomenon, something like a pop culture meme. It was similar to the way we use the word bug when we say she was bitten by the acting bug. For example, when Chicago Mayor Carter Harrison Jr. was running for re-election in 1903, he made this strange statement, quote, "The people have got the The people have got the Harrison microbe and they can't get away from it." Kind of describing himself as a disease, which is a strange statement for a politician. As I continued my investigation, I started looking at digitized databases of old newspapers, and I noticed something odd. Whenever newspapers mentioned the phrase Chicago microbes, they were often talking about bacteria and other microscopic gunk floating downstream from the Chicago River towards St. Louis. I wonder if this might have something to do with the team's nickname. Now, if you're up on Chicago history, you may know that this was just a few years after the Chicago River was reversed. The river originally flowed into Lake Michigan. The problem was the city dumped its sewage into the river, and it got its drinking water from the lake. So Chicago was essentially drinking from its own toilet. Local officials set out to fix this problem by reversing the flow of the river, and they accomplished that rather remarkable feat in January 1900. They opened the Chicago Sanitary Ship Canal. The canal took the river's water flowing south into the Des Plaines River, which took it further south into the Illinois River, and eventually it flowed into the Mississippi. But just a few hours after the canal opened, politicians in Missouri and St. Louis said, and I'm paraphrasing here, "Not so fast. We don't want those Chicago microbes coming down the river at us." They filed a lawsuit and then went straight to the U.S. Supreme Court, skipping all the intermediate courts. And the justices spent the next 6 years hearing arguments and taking evidence in a trial at the Supreme Court. At one point, a bacteriologist working for the city of St. Louis named Amand Ravold sent his brother on a secret mission to Lockport, Illinois. The brother had a whiskey barrel filled with a broth of bacteria called Bacillus prodigus, and he poured it into the canal. Now remember that name, it's going to come up later, Bacillus prodigus. Later on, Amand Ravold searched for those microbes downstream, and he claimed that he found some of the same microbes his brother had dumped into the canal from that barrel, thus proving that the microbes from Chicago could survive the trip downstream and were posing a danger to the people of St. Louis. Here's a quote from downstate newspaper, the Alton Weekly Telegraph. "Chicago microbes are going down the stream in bunches." The Chicago Tribune reported that microbe parties were the latest fad in St. Louis. The St. Louis Globe Democrat joked that Chicago microbes were impossible to get rid of, so St. Louis might as well use them for sport, holding microbe races. And I found a one-sentence item in the Tribune that said St. Louis baseball players were calling their rivals from Chicago microbes, but it didn't explain exactly why. I set aside my investigation for a while, but a few years later decided to give it another go, and this time I found my smoking gun, an article in the St. Paul Globe. For some reason, it was a newspaper in Minnesota that really explained all this. The story described the Chicago team arriving in St. Louis in April 1903 to play the first series of the season. The St. Louis Cardinals manager and star player Patsy Donovan greeted his Chicago rivals at the station. "Welcome to our city," he said, shaking their hands. A crowd of newsboys was watching, and one of them yelled out, "Hey there, Patsy, you're shaking hands with a microbe." Other people at the train station craned their necks to see who or what this kid was calling a microbe. And then 100 urchins, as the boys were called, started shouting, "Ho, microbes! The Chicago microbes is here to get beat by Patsy." And here's how the St. Paul Globe explained why these newsboys were using this insult. Of course, the newspaper said, Chicago's drainage ditch and the Bacillus prodigious are to blame. As the Chicago players went to their hotel, they heard shouts in the streets of St. Louis. Hey there, you microbe! The Chicagoans reportedly scowled and clenched their fists at all this. But their manager, Frank Seeley, assured them that microbe wasn't a derogatory term. Quote, I think it's a pretty good name, he said, and as long as the people of the city persist in saying they have to drink Chicago's microbes which come down through the drainage canal, the name will stick to you. While they were in St. Louis that week, the Chicagoans went to a racetrack. I'll give you 20-10, Mr. Microbe, a bookmaker said. The Chicagoans laughed, and one of them, pitcher Jock Menifee, said, it's a whole lot better than being called a Cub anyway. So there I had my proof. And well, I think this is about as close as you can get to proof of something like this. And finally, in 2012, I wrote an article about this for Time Out Chicago. Now, here are some footnotes to this story. In 1906, the Supreme Court finally arrived at the verdict, and they decided that Chicago could keep sending its microbes downstream towards St. Louis. And as you know, the Microbes team nickname did not stick. The Tribune never used it, but the Chicago American used it a lot in 1903, 1904, and 1905. And it faded away after that for some reason. In 1907, the team printed the name Cubs on its scorecards. And when the Cubs played in the World Series that fall, their new uniform had a picture of bears on the sleeves. The Cubs became one of the first teams in history with a uniform indicating a nickname. Now, just a week ago, I typed my name into a search engine, and I discovered a new article about the Chicago Microbes. It turns out last summer, the Stanford Law Review published an extensive and really quite fun essay titled When Nicknames Were Crowdsourced, or How to Change a Team's Mascot. It was written by Stanford Law professor Richard Craswell, who is described as, quote, a leading scholar of the economics and jurisprudence of contract law. And Craswell writes, we need to complete the story of the Chicago nicknames by considering the least likely nickname of all, the Chicago Microbes. For years, baseball historians conjectured that microbes must have referred to the small size of some of their team's players. However, Robert Loerzel has done research demolishing this conjecture. Sweet vindication. Now all we need is a Microbes World Series win. Go Microbes!